We're gonna start on the dot. It'll be great. Oh man. Okay. Happy 11 o'clock. So a couple of disclaimers before we get started. If this is not a space for political discourse, I'm going to try to be as apolitical as possible. One of the only things I'm bringing up is like feudalist Japan at one point. So if you have any feudalist Japan hot takes, I do ask that you keep those under a lid. I want to make this kind of a more positive space, and I don't want any arguments to break out, so let's just avoid all that stuff and have a good time. Second disclaimer is I'm not an expert. I don't have any kind of like degree in political science, but I find that power systems are one of the most fun parts of world building for me, so I wanted to share my kind of knowledge on that and go with that. So my name is Sadie, as you can tell. I actually fell out of interest with Homestuck a couple of years back, but I hopped back on for SOCCON 2019, which only the real ones will know that was the real SOCCON. Not the real SOCCON, the first one. I've attended SOCCON twice in the 2 years it's existed, but I haven't been a panelist until this year. This is actually my first panel ever, so bear with me. I'm currently working on a couple of MSPFA projects, and I'm usually on the MSPFA server. I'm pretty active on there, so if you see me around, feel free to say hello, or if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot me a DM, and I will respond when I can. I like to set up goals when I talk about things. So my goals for the panel today are a better understanding of working with governments in fictional settings, finding the nuances in this field and understanding how people drive politics, understanding how conflicts of power are central to developing a world or hierarchy or universe, and not being completely bored, because I know this topic can be boring, but we're going to try to have fun today. So to get started, I like to list a couple of philosophies when I talk about this kind of stuff, not like actual Aristotle philosophies, but kind of my rules of the trade. Politics is people. At the center of political conflict is almost always going to be conflict between people, most commonly ideologies. Ideologies are, of course, defined by sociology as how people view the world and how they make sense of things. The latter definition, I feel, is especially important because when ideologies are challenged, it can often feel like a personal attack. That's why even in professional settings, conflict can become extremely personal because core beliefs are being challenged. As we've certainly seen, politics is also cause and effect. When you're world building, consider what could drive people, to institute a certain kind of system. For example, a lot of communist systems are motivated by how industrialization knocks out some of the traditional hierarchies and creates an economics-driven system. Alternia's system, of course, calling the Homestuck, is extremely tyrannical because the rebellion threatened the existing balance of power in the caste system, which got people scared. Finally, politics is a struggle, and it's not only a struggle to write. At the end of the day, even civil politics involve a struggle for power. Power is, of course, a common motivator, but it's not an inherent corruptor. There's a really good quote by Robert Caro for this. Power doesn't always corrupt, it can cleanse. What I believe is always true about power is that power always reveals. When you have enough power to do what you always wanted to do, then you get to see what you always wanted to do. To understand why power is so important, you have to realize that people rarely view themselves as being in the wrong about things. If you perceive someone else's solutions as being completely incompetent, you're naturally going to be fearful of them going into power. Likewise, you're likely going to view your solutions as the best solutions that exist for a given problem. Even though power often reveals true intentions, sometimes people aren't aware of what their actual intentions are, so they can go in with the best ideals in mind and end up messing things up. Natural senses of fear and pride combine to fuel the struggle for power, but there's also some secondary factors like money, protection from certain legal matters, reputation, fame, etc., etc., and we will come back to these in a moment. I am going to check the chat right now. Any points? Okay, cool. Keep in mind, I'm viewing some notes, so if you have a note or like a question, there is, of course, a question room, but if you need to ping me, go ahead and do so I can keep track of stuff. So for some basics, I'm going to go over a basic systems review. A dictatorship or a monarchy is, of course, ruled by one. These two systems have some subtle differences. Monarchies usually operate under a mandate to rule. If you're familiar with the mandate of heaven, that kind of thing. Oligarchy is ruled by a few, and for fictional systems, this is my personal favorite, and of course we'll come back to that later. Democracy is ruled by many, but of course one of the downsides of this is it can result in the silencing of minority voices. There's an issue with majority rule called the tyranny of the majority, where voices that are dissenting can sometimes be washed out if there's a lot of people involved. And then, of course, anarchy, which is ruled by none. This can be no power system versus. Let me restart that. There's an important clarification between having no power system with anarchy and granting power to the people, which is more democracy. Democracy will usually have some kind of setup system, whereas anarchy is kind of that free rule, self-rule, but of course anarchy still tends to fall into a hierarchy after a certain amount of time. Certain factors are going to lead to more specific ruling systems, so if you get to all the subcategories of that stuff, which a lot of which I've avoided because they can get kind of controversial, but feel free to do some extra research on the side when you're developing these systems. I just want to give you a basic overview. One of the important things to focus on is how systems change, and so a lot of this has to do with the bodies that they rule over. But you have to ensure that these changes are motivated. One of the biggest world building challenges is finding motivations for why things come into play. So with power systems, it can be simple or it can be complex. You can have an intense rebellion history, like with Alternia, or simply like a greater deity or power figure deciding that a specific person is going to rule. Systems also influence those that they rule over. So ideologies currently in power are going to shape the worldview of those growing up underneath of them. These ideologies may stay even if change occurs, motivating unrest if compromises are not reached. So if you're growing up under a certain set of values and then the political climate is kind of changing, you're going to end up finding a little bit of dissent, especially if you sided with those values a lot. So that's why you see people commonly echoing the values that their parents have. A lot of the time when new systems come into power, this can create a lot of the dissenting voices, especially if things are being changed really radically. This is kind of that system of old versus new thinking. Some things that motivate certain systems: economic factors, cultural factors, and the diversity of populations. These three factors are really closely related, especially when talking about trade, because resources drive societies. If you don't have what you need, you can't really function properly. You need things like food and water and all that kind of stuff. One of the best kind of examples of this, I find, is, of course, feudalist Japan, as I mentioned before, because of the control of rice farms and the different hierarchies that's sourced from that. In a more traditional system, whoever controls the food, supply, the land, etc., has the power. But in a more modern version of this, whoever controls money, technology, etc., will tend to have more power. It's really just depending on what kind of setting you're going to be writing. So if you're dealing with sci-fi, you're going to be dealing with more science and technology and futuristic things that people need to have control over, and things like electricity access. Whereas in a more traditional or fantasy setting, you're going to be looking at those more traditional things. But of course, if magic is involved, you can do stuff with that. Really just when you sit down and start developing this stuff, kind of start listing those resources out and going over them. Some other things are goals for the population or domain, support of the population and domain, access to technology, and several other things. Okay. I mean, some people aren't able to get off. That is sad. Oh, thank you guys. Okay. If we don't have any other comments, then I will be moving on to the next section. Woohoo! Okay. So I mentioned that change is very important, especially when you're writing interesting power systems and how they evolve over time. Change is one of those things that requires more complex justifications. So when you're setting up your original power system, you can take those basic factors and generally find a system that will cover those or guarantee those. And so you can say, okay, here's a person with a lot of money, a lot of power. Maybe they have a family that's been ruling over this area for a really long time. And so they can naturally become the ruler. But as more people start to dissent with them, that can drive a lot of change. But all of those changes have to be clearly motivated. Things just don't switch for no reason, especially if people are already kind of used to and settled into a system. Keep in mind, too, that change often has some really complex end results. Not everything is going to be smooth when you're trying to figure out political systems. We've seen a lot of different countries dealing with how they kind of want to divvy up that power, where you have a traditional ruling family moving to a more, communist or democratic society, and then evolving from there. So a lot of those changes, of course, are going to be motivated by events in world history and different wars and things like that. When you're developing this kind of stuff for a comic or for a story, you don't have to create an entire war. I know a lot of that stuff can be really complicated, but sometimes it arises naturally. But what you can do is talk about changes in supplies, changes in dissenting voices, draw up some rebellions, have a great time with it, because a lot of it will help make your universe that much more kind of rich and colorful and in-depth. So coups, rebellions, etc. often have complex and unforeseen consequences that will shape the future development of the body being ruled. Stability can sometimes be an issue because, like I said, if people are locked into a system, sometimes they can kind of ignore the problems that arise with it because they're afraid of that change. Humans are really, we like a lot of consistency, and pretty much anyone does. So when you're starting to challenge those ideas, you can kind of get frightened by the idea of something new coming into play. Developing rich histories associated with these changes provides a more depth basis for those in power, and it can often motivate and create some conflict for citizens as well. Even in something like a spur adventure, where your main conflict is a game where you're fighting imps that drop gushers, your conflicts from the past and their original planet are going to carry over to the dynamics that occur between characters. This relates to when I was talking about ideologies earlier. These different system motivations, people hold these beliefs personally, so even if the original planet is just literally completely gone, and of course the entire ruling classes, they may still carry a lot of those ideas because that's what they were raised on. For example, if a rebellion is thrown over citizens not getting access to resources, it's more than likely going to result in a system that is ruled by said citizens. This is a good means of ensuring proper distribution. But if a single leader is in place, pressure from the citizens will probably be keeping them in check because they know that if they overthrew the leader before, they can probably do it again. Over time, this may evolve into even just going back to that corrupt system before, but for a short time, you would have a check on that power by the people. The threat of that rebellion and power upset is what often drives actions. Actions by a ruling body or ruling class, etc. These can be really good things, like granting more freedoms, or they can be really bad things, like making security that just completely dominates the world. The latter is usually more likely to incite rebellion. However, if you have people that are upset with a system that they feel is too lenient, they may also go the other way and try to crack down on things more. I'm going to do a quick pause before I go to the next section. Okay. Oh, thanks. Okay. So moving on to my personal favorite thing. Well, I'm going to say a lot of things are my favorite things because a lot of this is interesting to me. But of course, everyone enjoys a good rebellion. One of the key driving forces for change and really world building is the presence of rebellion. You're always going to have dissenting voices, and when those dissenters take action, it can result in some really interesting things. If you have a character who's kind of punk, who rebels against the system, you have to have a system that gives them reason to rebel. That's why I think a lot of political systems and things like that are often so overlooked in fan venture creation and in creation of any kind of universe. You can have a character who's kind of against the mold and against society and against the people in power, but if you don't have a power system that really motivates it, that's when characters can come off as kind of like arrogant and edgy, and if that is your intention, by all means, we all love a character who's a bit of an asshole. But if you're kind of wanting to motivate them with the world around them, keep in mind your government in your world building. That is one of the most important things. This, of course, a kind of dissent can go both ways. Maybe a character believes that a progressive system is way too lenient. When talking about rebellion, there are two main things to keep in mind, and the two main types. Covert rebellion is a subtler form of resistance. It's the usage of nonverbal codes on clothes and hair, its secret meetings, its development of underground groups, and its more subtle attacks or anonymous attacks against systems or supplies. This is a lot of the stuff done in secret, so people might write in a certain language that they develop. They might style their hair a certain way. They might wear a certain color or paint their door a certain shade. These are just codes that are existing in the rebellion that are really supposed to only be known to the rebellion. It's no direct resistance. more overt rebellion is more direct forms of resistance. So protest, riots, open meetings and rallies, and credited attacks or publicized operations. So where a covert rebellion will not take credit for something, or they'll just say, we're this anonymous group and, we're a dissenting voice and you need to start listening to us. More overt rebellions are going to be the ones saying, hey, yeah, we did this. If you have an issue with it, own the fuck up to it. The type of rebellion is, of course, going to depend on the determination of the people involved or the characters involved and the desperation of their circumstances. One of the biggest things to keep in mind is the social or economic standing of those who are involved. If you're higher ranking, you can get away with more shit. You can talk your way out. You can pay your way out. You can pull a, do you know who my father is? A lot of the times those can be people who lead things just because they have the financial resources to do so, and they can often get away with things. But of course, if somebody is of a higher standing, that creates a potential for an interesting conflict because they're going against their background and against the mold and against what they've learned and been raised on and supporting this rebel cause. It's like a question of loyalty to the cause or to their family or whatever organization they work with. If you're lower ranking, you're kind of more hoping to go unnoticed. You can play the fool. You can say, well, I obviously never would have known how to do something like that because I was raised in X neighborhood or I'm X type of person. That can be another kind of way of getting away with stuff. But of course, there is the issue that if you're lower ranking, people are not going to miss you as much. So whatever system is involved might be able to do away with you easier. Both of these have potential for really interesting dynamics between characters, and it's really interesting seeing when these two different classes kind of come together, because you can have someone with a lot of wealth and power and influence that's actually running this secret operation, and this other person who's like, okay, didn't fucking expect that. So it can create a fun dynamic between characters, and also one that can really play into your world building. In general, if you have an entirely oppressive system, you're usually going to go with a covert rebellion unless you have mass support of people, allies, etc. Especially if you can get other countries, or I guess if you're going really sci-fi, other planets involved. Unless you have that solid support, you're going to want to be a little bit more subtle. If you have some permissions, though, that's when you can go more overt, unless you want a slower or more subtle strategy. There is a time factor involved with all of these, and I'll talk about that in a second. But of course, there are exceptions to these two circumstances. If somebody feels like they have nothing to lose, even in a totally oppressive system, they might still go for it and gun for it and speak out against things so that an issue is brought to awareness. And likewise, even if a system is generally friendly and accepting and a decent platform, you still will probably have some people that want to work under the radar. And, to each their own. As I said, time is a factor in both types. Overt has the potential to be quicker, but also to be extinguished quicker. If somebody comes out and says, okay, I'm the leader of this rebel group, that is really, really easy for somebody to say, hey, so we're just going to kind of get rid of you. Covert is more sustainable for a longer time, of course, unless they get found out, which is, of course, another interesting dynamic you can pull. Generally, those are going to be the ones that are long-standing groups, and involve a lot of people and a lot of networks. Okay, we're going to be moving into some kind of tips for general building as applicable to you. So I'm going to take another quick break before we get into that. I'm also going to be doing an interactive section in a moment. So if you guys have any questions or anything so far, please let me know. I will be looking at the chat. Good job in overflow, guys. Yeah, thank you. I have a giant thing of iced coffee next to me that I have not drank from. I'm going to do a quick break for questions. Then we'll move on to stuff. Okay, older forms of government, such as feudalism or perhaps monarchy, are a lot more easy to get an audience behind dismantling them. But when it comes to other forms, what type of system do you find the most satisfying to show change or destruction of? Oh man, okay. This is going to sound a little bit weird, but I have a lot of fun with it. I really like seeing when power systems meant to involve people end up becoming corrupt especially in like a fan venture type setting, especially with trolls, because it creates like such a shocking dynamic. Because you're like, oh, this is, you know, ruled by the people, and this is supposed to be this great thing, and it gets completely flipped upside down on its head. Even though that can be frustrating for a reader, because we really want our protagonist to win, especially if they're dealing with an oppressive society, it can actually be a lot of fun to write, and it can be a lot of fun to witness, because it's such a kind of inversion of what we normally expect. So even though I've said I prefer oligarchies, kind of breaking down that democracy can present some really interesting dynamics. Animal Farm, okay. If this is going to be answered later, please feel free to ignore, but how would you deal with a power vacuum? Maybe even created by the protagonist, taking out the ruler, but not having any intention of taking over in a satisfying way. It depends on your definition of satisfying, I will say. Whenever I'm developing a system, and I really like writing conflicts, because I don't know, that's just the, maybe it's because I was on debate team for a couple of years, but I find that when you're dealing with those kind of power vacuums or sitting duck positions, actually having that stall can be really interesting, because it forces people to realize what they want. Do they want a single leader, or do they want a council? Do they want power by the people, or do they want to limit that power a little bit more? It will force those characters involved to really evaluate what they want and the motivations behind that, and then go on to develop it into the new system in charge. All right, I find myself often becoming too focused on making realistically detailed history or timeline of the world, but then never actually referencing or needing most of the political and historical lore I've developed. Do you find historical or political timelines of events, rulers, etc. useful when world building? Are they too restrictive for the writer or unnecessarily complicated? Or do you think they are important to develop for context as either a writer or a reader? How do you make use of the lore you created without it being overly complex and irrelevant to the story or world? These are all fantastic questions, so props to you. So for the first one, I find that timelines help a lot, but I can honestly say, as somebody who's never been able to keep a planner in my life, if you don't kind of jive with timelines, you don't really need to feel obligated to make them. And those can actually be an obstacle to some of the more complex development. But if you find they help inform you, or if you're working with a team, help inform your team, or even they're just a fun piece of information to release later on like a, I don't know, anniversary of release, then I would go ahead and go for those, because they can help you sort things out. I personally don't tend to do them as much, but of course that can create some issues when we're trying to figure out where things go chronologically. I usually make PowerPoints to organize stuff, which maybe it's just because I've been in the American public school system for too long, but that kind of helps me step through stuff, because you can order your slides and kind of put that stuff through. Are timelines too restricted for the writer and unnecessarily complicated? Again, that depends on you. I find that quick notes help a lot, but if you want to elaborate on things, by all means, go ahead. Google Sheets, if you want to set up a timeline with a traditional kind of format, can be really helpful, because you can color code those blocks and kind of stretch stuff out, and just keep things in a more organized fashion. And of course, you can have multiple Google Sheets under one file, so that can be really useful. I do think that stuff is important to develop for context. However, I don't think you need like a set diagram or order of events right off the bat. If you're just kind of getting started with organizing stuff. Also, if you hear a lawnmower outside, my neighbor is doing some yard work. But if you find that that kind of stuff can kind of get you in a rut and keep you from moving on to actual development, then I really wouldn't do it. But for context-wise, knowing when things occur is really important for both the history of the body being ruled and also just setting up those dynamics between characters. Because again, when a character grows up underneath a certain system, then that can shape a lot of their ideologies and perspectives. But you want to make sure that things kind of line up, and you're not saying, oh, well, this person grew up under the system, and then they were like 27 when the system actually started. But that's like my main tip there. And making use of the lore you created without it being overly complex and irrelevant. I find it so hard to make lore that isn't really relevant, because I feel like there's always going to be someone who's interested. even if it's just somebody that you shoot ideas back and forth with, and even if it only ends up being like a poster in the back of a panel, it can still help you get organized and still come up in character conversations. Of course, you want to avoid getting too exposition-y, which can be kind of hard, but when you have such important things at play, like a political system ruling multiple bodies, then you really can expect that to come up in day-to-day conversation. And, you know, we see it all the time. So if something kind of makes you happy and makes your brain happy in developing it, I would say by all means go ahead. It is up to you how you want to simplify it and break things down. But honestly, I believe the more development, the better. But if you do find it's getting you in a rut and you need to pull back a little bit, you can always advise with somebody else and see their opinions on what you should include. But of course, you know, you're going to be the final judge, so if you want to throw something in there, by all means, go ahead. Okay, if a system is radically changed with the older ruling class destroyed radically and suddenly, would there be a chance of a secondary revolution from people who oppose the sudden change? Yes, and that is one of my favorite things. So, whenever you have side A and side B, and of course there's going to be multiple sides involved, but you know, you can view political opinions as kind of a gradient, but you have your two extremes. Say side A wins this rebellion, topples the monarchy, it's a great time, institutes this new system, everybody's jiving with it. You're still going to have people that do not jive with it, especially if they are people on side B who have completely opposite opinions and might be afraid that they're not going to be heard or that they're going to be spoken over. If side B even vaguely supported that original power system, they're probably going to work to bring it back in some form, even if it's like a more subtle form, or even if it's just a small opposing council, or it's those covert operations. They're still going to be working to counter stuff. So yes, and if you write that, you're very cool, because I think it's a fun dynamic. Okay, there's a layer of cultural control like we see in America where people are proud to be living the land of the free, and it's like, free to what? Free to choose from 10 different brands of cereal? Honestly, you'll find that some people value that kind of stuff and that some people really don't care. My dad, for example, grew up in a more like poor neighborhood, so his options were already kind of limited, and he really, really appreciates the different choices that he can make now that he's in a better financial standing. Same kind of thing, if somebody comes from a system where they didn't have access to much and they really appreciate that, that can come out. But it can also be that they just really don't give a shit. People, of course, have different opinions, and sometimes we don't expect them to have the opinions that they do. But, you know, whatever decisions that they make and whatever they're happy with will go ahead and tie into things. And unless it's an issue of dire importance, usually it's not going to create a lot of conflict. But it's in matters that are more pressing, like civil rights, things like that, that a lot of those kind of old world, new world ideas can come up. Is the panel being recorded? Yes, I believe so. If not, I have all my notes, so I can just go ahead and like post those somewhere to my Twitter or just figure that out. But all the information is here. And if you have any questions, always feel free to DM me. What about unusual or hypothetical forms of government like cyberocracy or corporatocracy? For that latter one, we're actually going to talk about that in a second. We're going to be developing a little city together. It'll be a great time. I really, really like unusual forms of government, but those general types that I mentioned before, those will usually still fall underneath of that. So if you have if you have a bunch of corporations ruling something, that's going to be more of an oligarchy. If you have one person that has a lot of financial influence, maybe they're a great inventor, maybe they make a lot of stuff, they're going to have more power and influence in that kind of system. When you're developing those kinds of things, look at what traditionally exists and then look at what elements you want to include. Look at what resources are going to be different. So like I mentioned before, going for electricity versus land, things like that. And go ahead and start kind of fusing those ideas together. And of course, I always say it's important to have someone to bounce ideas off of, even if it's like, hey, it's 1 a.m. and you're my friend, can I please run this past you? Because people will usually be fine with it. Maybe don't do it at 1 a.m. But, you know, having someone to kind of run those ideas by is very important. And even with my panel notes, I had a couple of people that I ran my stuff by just because I find it to be important. So if you're coming up with those more unusual systems, get somebody to bounce ideas off of and go ahead and look at those fusions between traditional government and kind of the technology and power systems of the future. Soren, knock it off. What's your opinion on fake rebellions, where somebody intends to fully continue the system, but with themselves in charge and not intending to change the status quo? By the way, we're going to get back to presenting, I think, 1135-ish. For realism and what makes or breaks it. Fake rebellion meaning not wanting to change the system, but served as to such others in the rebellion. That is so cool. Please write that. I think that when you have people that have that kind of intentions, especially if you have a climate where a lot of people are rebelling and there are a lot of dissenting voices, and you have a person use that as a strategy, A, that's a really clever strategy, but B, that is such a fascinating dynamic to set up. I think that they're really cool and they have a lot of cool potential. You just have to make sure that it's not like a, hey, fellow rebels, you know, got my skateboard. You have to make sure that they're genuinely convincing and charismatic enough to step up as a leader while still having that loyalty to the old system. So a lot of this is a balancing act. That's one of those things. How would you create a rebellion without leaning into the dichotomy of needless violence or unnaturally poised intentional jabs? How do you keep the humanity and fallibility of the rebellion itself while still making it work? So as I mentioned, politics is people and rebels are also people. When you're getting into that kind of system, you're going to have people who want to handle things differently. So you're going to have the person that wants to go ahead and smash a car, but then you're also going to have the person that just wants to release some information, lean into that stuff. I find that in those cases, if you make a rebel group, make them be really good friends. Even have like a found family dynamic because you have people with the same ideas as you. And when you get to that, people can often find compromises with people that they hold close to them, even if it's just kind of like temporarily settling things. That's how you can kind of create that balance. If it's a massive network, have it be run by somebody who genuinely cares about the cause that they're vying for. Have them be able to listen to the different voices of people involved and have them use some, creative tactics. Rebellion is rarely ever super poised and super clean, and as I've mentioned, the results can be pretty messy. But when you have people that are really willing to fight for a cause and they're willing to do so together, that's when you can kind of find that happy medium. Yeah, of course, no problem for answering the questions. And yeah, I'll go ahead and share the notes. Do you feel it's possible to create a likable or redeemable ruler of corrupt governments? Does it only matter when they were of the original creators of the system, or if they were simply born into it and perpetuate it because of tradition? What if the original system was good, but the current rulers over the corrupt version, and they don't really know that? That is so cool! Again, write that. Y'all have such good ideas, and I encourage you, if you want to make something with this, by all means, go ahead, because you guys are really creative. So I think that is very much a possible thing. I think a lot of the time, if you have a younger ruler coming into power, say a relative suddenly dies, or there's like a sudden coup, or a family member assassinates another, I don't know if you want to go Hamlet style. I think that's Hamlet, I'm not totally sure. But I think when you get into those situations where somebody is just kind of trying to figure out what's going on and trying to figure out the best option, especially if they've been kind of brainwashed or groomed into a system, that's when you can create kind of that inner conflict and have a redeemable person. A lot of the time, I say redeemable characters have to atone for their actions. And that just means they have to do something that actually makes up for what they have done. Smoothing it over, slapping a band-aid on something is not going to be your best bet. But when you create a character with an inner drive or an inner idea that kind of changes, that's when you start to make somebody who's a human person with complexities and different levels, and you can really make them actually redeemable. Of course, there's always going to be some people saying that people aren't redeemable at all. And, shit happens. Honestly, when that does happen, you've created a really good complex character because people are always going to have polarized opinions. Okay, I think our last question for now. Please feel free to keep submitting questions because I'm also going to be taking more questions at the end. Last one for now. How would I make a nightmare state that's both over the top and realistic? Burgundy or HRE from the New Order or Alternia itself? Nightmare state, when you're making I'm assuming you mean a really oppressive system. Keep in mind that a lot of issues and a lot of tyranny are driven by fear. fear of people with different opinions, fear that those people are going to ruin things around you, fear that people are going to push ideologies that you don't agree with at all. When people feel like they're being threatened, a lot of the time they can lash out. And you see that even in just personal reactions and connections with people. When you have somebody with power and influence, that can manifest in them trying to really control a country and keep their grip on it, or country, planet, whatever. A lot of that time, even when you have these really corrupt systems, just keep in mind that kind of fear motivation, and that will generally get you to a more realistic standpoint, because people don't intend to be evil. Even the shittiest person you know does not intend to be evil. They just think they're right. So a lot of the time when you have those kinds of systems in place, you just have somebody who thinks they know the best, or at least doesn't want to deal with the consequences or the alternatives of their beliefs, instituting these really, really strict hierarchies and systems to keep control over everything. Okay, that's going to be my last question for now. I'm going to check in with the chats. Oh, I love y'all helping each other. That's great. Please keep doing that. That is awesome, actually. I really like the people singing Herculicious in Overflow. That reminds me of the Dave Discord after Test Request. Alrighto. Are y'all ready to make a little system with me? Make a little city system? Is there going to be a recording? Yes. Okay, so a few key considerations before we begin. This is the do-it-yourself guide to power systems. How big is the system going to be? A city, planet, galaxy, etc.? This is not going to impact ideologies, but more logistics and organization. Keep in mind, if you're in a massive system, you're really not going to have a centralized government. Generally, bigger systems will have more of a chance for diverse ideals and rebellion. This will exist if a system is oppressive or not. One can overexert power or undercut their higher-up strict orders. When you have these kind of, especially if you have like spaceships independent of each other, you're going to have somebody who's a ruling figure, independent of a centralized government. Galactic or multi-universe settings cannot realistically support a centralized government. This we can see in early colonization efforts in North America, with Spain losing influence due to distance and lack of easy travel, because you had to take a giant boat and go across the literal ocean. In this case, you would have to take your spaceship and fly across millions of light years, and that's just not super convenient. Centralized systems can exist, but they're going to break from conventional reality. See Homestuck, where rebellion is still rampant, but discussions of ruling over the empire are spoken about very little aside from the condescension. Especially because you have things in place like the psionics, usage of people with powers, and kind of still subjugating people within the system, literally to power ships. Like, that is definitely kind of breaking from the norm there of a centralized system, but we know one still exists. And of course, a lot of that is driven by fear. Wow, it all ties together. The justification required for the system it's more likely to be kind of semi-independent, where leaders of subgroups are the ones that hold actual power. So like the captain of your really cool spaceship, or a fleet commander, or things like that. Another thing to consider are what hierarchies will play into your politics and what kind of feedback loops exist. A great example of one of these is, of course, the caste system in Homestuck, where the political system feeds into the oppression of the lower classes, and the belief that the lower classes are lesser feeds into the political hierarchy. Because of their numbers and abilities, by raw strength, we know that lower blood colors have the upper hand. Doc Scratch even kind of states this, but their fear is keeping them subservient, especially because the last rebellion attempt failed so badly. You also have to keep in mind what ideologies are being contested. I really recommend making these relevant to the central conflicts in your story. So if you're going for a more philosophical study, or you're going for different conflicts between characters that are based on those beliefs that they hold, tying systems ideologies in with those that characters possess can create a lot of interesting parallels between your cast and your world. Their arguments can play out on a larger scale. So maybe X person really supports saving the turtles, and the other person supports fishing. You can see that play out in massive policies that are going to determine what actually happens, And then either character can be convinced of either side, or either character can protest, or things can expand more from there. Sometimes seeing the results of those actions can cause them to question their beliefs. Okay, so now for some city building. Our example for today is going to be on a smaller scale. It's going to be a city. And I'm doing that because it's very centralized, and you can go with more traditional forms of government. I was actually considering doing a galactic scale, but I was like, nah, that's too fucking complicated. But we're going to say that this city is independently run. Maybe it's on an island. Maybe it's on the top of a mountain. Maybe it's just hiding from the government. Whatever it is, we're not going to be focusing on more federalist systems. We will say that this is a sci-fi city because I want to be able to discuss technology usage and access. Keep in mind more traditional settings, as I said before, and past settings and fantasy settings. Those resources that are focused on will be different. Fantasy might focus on magic, traditional on land, but our sci-fi is going to focus on technology and industrialization. So, what will we name our city? Cityville. Pardon my little slurp there. Okay. Very safe city, not clickbait. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of votes for something named after me, which feels interesting, talking about corrupt power systems, but I'm seeing a lot for Cityville and City. We're going to name it Cityville, but the D is silent. And I hope that's a good enough compromise. Okay, so in Cityville, with the silent D, it is impossible to know what exactly future technology will be. We're looking at VR, we're looking at robots. If you saw our trailer yesterday, we're looking at sentient robots, man. It's all coming into play here. But we can assume some of the basic things required. Electricity, you gotta power shit. Food, you have people that need food. Oxygen, breathing is important. Shout out to the Lorax. Medicine, people get injured, you gotta be able to treat them. Water, you need that for sustenance. Land, gotta put your factories on something, gotta put your homes on something. Money, it makes the world go around. Assistance, so being able to help people out and people that are advisors on things. And upkeep. The latter is especially important because those machines are going to break. Somebody needs to fix it. Now we're going to have another little question here. What will Cityville's key tech export be? Webcomics. Scenes. GPUs, movies, Google Glass, vibes, webcomics, oxygen, fans. No, not the Covert Rebellion Code. Artificial intelligence, drinkable water, DeBaby, really cool boats. Oh my fucking god, these are really good. Okay, we're going to say Cityville came up with a really, really cool idea. It's a Google Glass, but it only transmits MSPFAs. And they are making fucking bank on this stuff. Let me go ahead and note this down. We're gonna call it the Grant Glass after the MSPFA site admin. So the reason these are so valuable is because MSPFA, the boom of MSPFA, is really reaching its heyday. Even however many fucking years in the future, there's cyberpunk comics, there's fantasy comics, there's amazing things happening. Suburb 17.0 just came out in a new fan venture. So these are really popular things. Keep in mind, any exports will have to be of value in that society. Without demand, there's no profit from supply. In this case, we're going to say these MSPFAs are a great form of escapism from the industrial hell that these people are living in. Welcome to Cityville, baby. Okay. So we're going to be taking Cityville and giving it 3 different versions of government. Version 1 is going to be the monarchy. This is not a traditional monarchy, it's economics-based. So whoever mentioned that earlier, I see you. This is sometimes referred to as a kleptocracy or a merchant kingdom. The ruler will be reliant on business and industry, because, capitalism, but also because they come from an influential technological family. The mayor of Cityville runs the show. He is the monarch. Because of his family's goals of profit, will make his goals profit-focused. So these goals will counter anything overly environmentalist, anti-capitalist, or pertaining to opposing businesses. Can you think of any other examples of what this guy might be against? And yes, MSPFA is a valid input. Maybe he's just shilling stuff, man. It's up to him. Sometimes seeing it's an emergent kingdom. That was a recommendation from a friend who reviewed stuff, so my apologies if I made a mistake there. The main character of CD Vylil is a she-they type beat who likes 80s stuff. You're correct. That is canon now. Maybe they're against other fan comics. Ooh. Yes, perfect. These are all great ideas. Keep in mind that this mayor's input is the input. No one's going to directly counter them, and even though they may have advisors, their say will be, in theory, the final say. Now for the rebellion. Possible sources include their advisors, other family members, or the general public, especially if resources are being diverted too much into what they're producing. These are, of course, rebels for counter causes. The issue with monarchy is the prevalence of family and familiar hierarchy. If our mayor has more powerful or influential relatives, or they inherited the position at a younger age, they might be easier to overthrow. Or the opposite. They might enact really strict policies to affirm their influence, squashing any possible rebellion. Version 2, the oligarchy, which of course I've named as my favorite multiple times, because they present such an interesting dynamic. They're not massive enough for majority influence to squash opposing views, but they're not just one person. That allows for some diversity in opinions of rulers, but still on a somewhat intimate scale. A council, or a city council of Cityville, may present different ideals. Could be influential business owners, could be selected by a council head, they could be voted in by the public, but be careful not to make it a totally democratic vote. The public may more so entail to those who are influential in business, especially in our Grant Glass productions. There's inevitably going to be some conflict between members. These are all influential people, so they can get away with a lot of shit if they want to. This includes subtle sabotage, ruining reputations, etc. And dissonant members may be disposed if a majority of the council will agree on things. To create some interesting dynamics and rifts in a city, establish a key ideology conflict. We're going to say that Cityville has a really nice frog population. I don't know where the hell Cityville is located, but they've got some sick-ass frogs. But of course, there's also the industrial aspect. We need to produce more Grant Glasses. We're going to say that person A is a really big supporter of the frogs. They've got a little frog hat. They're obviously non-binary, and they are here to stand up for the frog sanctuary. But the other believes in expanding factory landmass, because they believe that Grant Glass is the only thing we need to focus on. In worst case, you can just simulate frogs. We'll say person A has a lot of media influence, but person B has rapport with people. How could either one take down the other? That is an option. Political assassination through the media. Yes. They make an MSP-based propaganda. A call-out post. Media influence could spread controversy and fake news. Perfect. Discredit or smear. Blackmail. MSP-based smear campaign. Cancel over Twitter. Yes. Even the silly ones, honest to God, in this hellish setting, I'm going to say definitely happen. Because these are great. Frog supporter gives every supporter a frog. Honestly, it would win me over. Alright, so these are great ideas. Reminder again that politics are people. Oligarchies allow pettiness on an influential and sometimes dangerous scale. Actions become more about settling personal conflicts than pertaining to city needs. And therefore, while Cityville may need new roads, policies may instead focus on building a tower for frogs. I don't fucking know. It's Frog Tower now. It's in the center of Cityville. Come visit it. It's got a fountain. Building a new tech center over a sacred frog habitat versus building a frog sanctuary on an area slotted for a manufacturing group. Both of these would be focusing more on the desires of those in the oligarchy than the needs of the people. With Potential lies in the conflicts between members and the limited size of the ruling body, which can lead to a lot of potential for rebellion between members from a society angry about inaction, etc. It's not a very stable form of government if members cannot agree at all, so be ready to write in some change. Natural progression is going to be filing it down to a few leaders or a single leader that outlasts the rest by finances, influence, etc. Or, fucking untapped frog supply. In this case, probably the manufacturer of the main export or the one controlling its funding or supplies. The frog comments. Version 3 is our democracy. We're going to do a city council, but this time it's a little bit more chill. More of a push to settle things since the public can, in theory, just vote members out for inactivity. We can create some limited voting systems for some spice, a little bit of spice, but if it will start to lean more towards an oligarchy if voting is limited to like the elite. You can find a happy medium between all of these types of ruling, but just keep in mind those distinctions. Compromises need to be made on balancing sources of conflict, like expanding industrialization and manufacturing versus environmental considerations. Keep in mind the tyranny of the majority. Those in the lead at the time have more say as to what is prioritized in policy decisions. This can lead to rebellion if there's issues with silencing. More restrictive laws might be passed, but those will encourage more protest. Keep in mind for labeling this as a true democracy, not something just calling itself as much. Thus, we can permit a little bit more overt rebellion. Because a true democracy generally allows for more compromises, those rebellions are going to be more likely. Pressure from people, as they technically have the most influence over things, though obviously exceptions do exist. In this case, there might be a giant citywide protest over the frog sanctuaries versus the manufacturing plants that all leads to a vote by the elected city council. You can still do a lot of interesting stuff with the democracy, and as I said before, that system falling apart can be really, really cool, but generally it's going to be a system that involves a lot more compromise, so it's a little bit more sustainable. Our takeaway. Did we meet our goals? We'll see. Better understanding of working with government in fictional setting. We defined our types of government and our motivators for them. Finding the nuances in this field and understanding how people drive politics. We discussed how power is a motivator and how conflicting ideologies can result in different systems. Understanding of how conflicts of power are central to developing a world hierarchy universe, etc., or a city where there's a lot of fucking frogs. Ideologies and conflicts from someone's home and things seen around them will influence them. And I only hope you're not completely bored. I had a lot of fun presenting to y'all, so thank you so much for being such an interactive audience, and thank you so much for stopping by today. We have about 8 minutes-ish left for questions, and then I'm going to have to hop off. That was not an intentional frog pun, god damn it. But if at any point in the day you want to DM me with questions, run ideas past me, I will be here, and I will also be in the MSPFA server. And if any of this has inspired you to create something, I encourage you to hop over there because all of the community there and the different creators are wonderful people. A lot of my friends in MSPFA are actually in the panel audience right now, so shout out to them. And of course, I work on one myself, which we, premiered our trailer for yesterday. So opening up for some more questions. Oh, I'm so glad you guys enjoyed. That's awesome. Fucking overflow. How do you combine political world building with aliens whose psychology leads them to prioritize different things from humans? How do you make politics realistic while not being human? Develop what they need to focus on. Resources is a really easy way of doing that. What is important to them and their society, and kind of build off of that. They'll generally prioritize what they need to live. Okay, where can we find you on Twitter and other platforms? My Twitter is, I'm going to type it in here, compact little disc. And let me actually double check to make sure. Yes. I have some completely irrelevant tweets, but feel free to stop by, DM me, send me a question. I will be on there. What's my opinion on the one slur? Honestly, a babe. Can't lie, but a little too capitalist for me. Oh, I'm so glad you guys enjoyed. Okay, that's a relief. Favorite examples of power systems from existing media. I honestly really like Homestucks. I really like the Alternia system. I like things that are driven by rebellion a lot. I find them to be really fun. So, yeah, when you have systems like that, it can be really cool. Oh, thank you, Nessie, for answering that. Somebody is pledging allegiance. Very cool. When flipping a system, what's the hardest obstacle to expect in the aftermath? Opinions and people. Of course, things can turn violent. You'll also have people controlling resources. When that stuff happens, you really have to convince others, and that can be really hard because people will most of the time, 9 times out of 10, stick with their opinions. Opinions on Tavros. Tavros is pretty fucking cool. My favorite covert rebellion code, probably colors, because I wouldn't notice that. I just like when things are colorful. But like painting a door green, it's really fucking cool. It's subtle, it's great, and it's a pretty noticeable thing. And it can also kind of be funny if you have a rebel group where somebody's colorblind and they're like, God damn it, guys, I don't understand this. What is the Discord? Keep talking about the MSPFA Discord. So if you go on mspfa.com, there should be a link to the Discord server at the top. If you're there to develop ideas or you just want to see your favorite MSPFA creators, feel free to stop on by, ask questions, develop stuff. I will be in there, and if you want to ping me an adventure talk on that channel, you feel free to do so, and I'll try and help you out. Frog-shaped bagel real. God, I hope so. Favorite revolutionary weapon? Words. I like when people just knock each other out with words. Type of system people will find boring, uninteresting to read about. A system where everyone gets along, even if the system's really fucked up and corrupt, if everyone agrees, it's boring. You always need a dissenting voice. Mixed hours and I missed the thing. Will there be a recording available? Yes, there will be. And worst case, feel free to ask me any questions. Okay. The correct answer C to you at best. Yeah, honestly, you guys are welcome. I'm so relieved and happy that you guys enjoyed. I am going to go ahead and share the panel notes. I'll be updating these with some comments later. But I have it on to view, so if you guys want to read over these and keep these as a resource, feel free to do so. To get to the MSPFA server, go on mspfa.com. There should be a link to the server towards the top. Okay, I'll be in here for a couple more minutes. Oh, thank you guys. Yeah, I'm so glad a lot of people seem to have enjoyed it. Because this is my first panel ever, so appreciate it. Glad y'all got some good information. Yeah, of course. Where will the recording be archived? Probably going to upload it to YouTube at some point, and I will post that to my Twitter. Oh yeah, I'll certainly apply next year. We'll see if I get that. Oh, you stayed up late for this. Make sure you get some rest. I appreciate the support. Thank you so much. Available to talk after the panel in an area. Yeah, I'll be in the main chats here. I'll be in DMs. I'll be on Twitter. Just send me a note. That is back. A friend of mine worked on the WTD panel. My Twitter is at CompactLittleDisc. Good luck to the next panel. Try to top this. I try not to be in competition. I know all the panels lined up for today are going to be fantastic. So stay tuned for those. And, you know, enjoy it. Have fun at SOCCON. This is actually the event where I met the members of my MSPFA team. And so it's a really special convention to my heart because a lot of those people are really good friends of mine. So I really hope that you get some of those kinds of connections and stuff out of this, or even the inspiration to go ahead and make your own stuff. Because I feel like it's one of the best parts of this. Yeah, if the schedule confused you at all, oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Complimenting my voice. I love that. That's adorable. Thank you. Yeah, if you missed anything, I posted a link to the notes up there. And I will resend that. It's just a Google Doc. I'll also be posting this to Twitter. Okay, got about a minute left. Purple Bloods turning against the ruler. I love that. I feel like Purple Bloods, people tend to make the exact same. And so when you have that differentiation, it can be really cool. And of course, they're pretty powerful people. Did you hydrate yet? Yes, but I will definitely need more water in a second. Oh, back is so sweet. Okay. 30 seconds left. All right. Don't be nervous. It'll be all good. Okay. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad this was a good introduction. All right. Yeah, no, of course, no problem. Really glad you guys enjoyed. I'm going to be heading off in a couple of seconds here, but as I've said, have any questions, feel free to message me on any of the platforms I mentioned. And if you're in the MSPFA server, feel free to say hi.